My parents sold my inheritance to fund my brother's luxury wedding. So, I bought their house at auction and made them rent it from me. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and the house I grew up in wasn't just a building. It was my sanctuary. Every creaking floorboard, every faded wallpaper pattern, every corner smelled like memories that shaped me. I remember summer evenings, sitting on the back porch with my grandparents, Grandpa humming old tunes while Grandma baked her lemon pies, filling the entire house with that sweet, citrusy warmth that seemed to wrap around you like a hug. Birthdays weren't just dates. They were full days of laughter, homemade cakes with uneven frosting, and the smell of candles melting into the waxy birthday wishes. Holidays were chaos in the best way. Trees crammed into corners, lights tangled and blinking, the kitchen flooded with relatives, and the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon. This house was more than walls and a roof. It was stability, a place where I could feel safe, even when the world outside felt unpredictable. But even in this cocoon of warmth, the cracks in our family dynamic were always visible. My younger brother, Ethan, was treated like a prince. Every small success he had was celebrated endlessly. "Look at him, so talented, so smart," Mom would gush, eyes twinkling like he'd just solved world hunger. And me? I was reliable, silent, the one who fixed things without fanfare. Paying bills, patching leaks, mowing the lawn, organizing closets. These were my contributions, and yet they were always met with the passing, "Thanks, I guess," as if being responsible was invisible. I'd often find myself lingering near the living room doorway, overhearing whispered conversations. That evening, I caught Mom and Dad talking about wedding budgets for Ethan. The words, luxury wedding and funding, floated in the air. A lump formed in my throat. Something told me that this wasn't just about flowers and catering. It was about priorities, and I could feel, like a cold draft under the door, that this house, my sanctuary, might soon become collateral in a plan I wasn't part of. I'm the type of person who notices the little things. How my parents' smiles softened for Ethan, how they practically glowed whenever he spoke about his big plans, and how I could clean an entire kitchen without anyone batting an eye. I've always tried to stay out of the spotlight, keeping my head down and doing my part, but it was hard not to notice the subtle favoritism that painted the family dynamic so clearly. Every achievement of mine, good grades, overtime at work, paying off a bill before it was due, was met with polite nods or a passing, "That's nice," while Ethan's smallest success became a reason to throw a party. It didn't help that Ethan loved attention. He thrived on it, soaking up compliments like a sponge, charming relatives with his laugh, his easy way of making people feel special. My parents adored this, constantly reminding me, sometimes in half-joking tones, that I could learn a thing or two from him. "Ethan just has a way with people," Mom would say, her eyes warm on him, while I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, like I was being quietly erased. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself that family dynamics were complicated, and that one day, my hard work would speak for itself. Then came the wedding plan. One evening, I sat in the kitchen, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I couldn't ignore the conversation drifting from the living room. "We'll have to adjust the savings," Dad murmured. "Ethan deserves a proper wedding. It's not every day he turns 30. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. A proper wedding for him? Were they really willing to bend everything, our finances, our family resources, just for Ethan's extravagance? I sank into the kitchen chair, trying to process it. My stomach churned, a mix of anger, disbelief, and a rising sense of betrayal. I'd always prided myself on being responsible, reliable, the one who kept things together. And now it felt like all those years of loyalty and sacrifice meant nothing in the face of Ethan's golden child status. Something was shifting beneath my feet, and I could feel the tension building, tightening like a rope around my chest. What they didn't know, though, was that I had a memory for details and a determination that was quietly starting to grow. I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation, replaying every word in my head like a broken record. The idea that my parents could prioritize Ethan's wedding over my future, over everything I'd ever contributed, made my chest tighten with a mix of anger and disbelief. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a temporary strain on finances. Maybe they didn't realize how much it hurt. But deep down, I knew this went far beyond a simple misstep. Something had shifted, and it felt like the first crack in the foundation of the home I had always trusted. A few days later, I stumbled onto something that made the betrayal painfully real. I was reorganizing the filing cabinet in the study, mostly out of habit, when I noticed a folder tucked behind the mortgage papers. Curiosity overpowered caution. Inside, there were documents I wasn't supposed to see. The deeds to the house, financial statements, and a plan outlining the liquidation of my inheritance to fund Ethan's dream wedding. My heart sank and my hand shook. I sat on the floor, staring at the papers, as a cold, bitter realization settled over me. My parents had literally sold my future to make their golden child shine brighter. Later that evening, I tried to bring it up casually during dinner. "Mom, Dad, I found some of the documents about the house and the inheritance," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mom looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh, that. Don't worry about it. It's for the family," she replied, dismissive and calm, like she was talking about rearranging the furniture. Dad didn't even look at me, busy carving his steak. I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to argue, to scream, to make them understand the depth of the betrayal, but no words came out. Instead, I pushed my plate away, retreating into a silence that felt louder than any shouting match. The reality was sinking in. The family I thought had always had my back was complicit in taking what was mine. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the familiar ceiling, I realized that nothing would ever feel safe in that house again. Something had to change, and I had no idea yet just how far I would go to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The next few weeks were brutal, though outwardly, I tried to keep life normal. I continued doing all the things I'd always done, paying bills, fixing broken appliances, keeping the house running, but every task felt heavier, like I was dragging bricks tied to my chest. Even the familiar creak of the stairs seemed accusatory, as if the house itself was reminding me of what had been taken. Every time I passed Ethan laughing with my parents, or catching their proud glances aimed at him, a sharp pang of resentment tore through me. I loved my family, but the gap between how they treated him and how they treated me had become unbearable. One evening, I was helping Mom organize the guest list for Ethan's wedding. She handed me the papers with that same patronizing smile. "Can you double-check these names for me? You're so good with details," she said. I nodded silently, pretending to scan the list, while internally, I was calculating every way this wedding was draining, not just our finances, but my dignity. Every decision they made, from catering to floral arrangements, was like another subtle slap to my face, a constant reminder that my contributions had always been invisible, and now, my inheritance was gone. The tension spilled into conversations at the dinner table, though mostly unspoken. Ethan would joke about how lucky he was to have such supportive parents, his voice full of entitlement, and I could feel the tight knot of frustration growing in my stomach. I tried to speak up once. "I've been saving for the house repairs too, you know," but it was brushed off with a shrug from Dad and a vague, "We know, honey. Don't worry about it." That line, dismissive as it was, pushed me closer to the edge. Late that night, I sat alone in the living room, the faint smell of burnt toast lingering from dinner, staring at the staircase. I realized something fundamental. I had spent my entire life trying to keep the family together, to be responsible, to be reliable. And now, all that effort had been quietly erased. A new, dangerous thought began to form in my mind. If they wouldn't honor my loyalty, maybe I'd have to take matters into my own hands. But I didn't yet know how, and I wasn't sure if I had the courage. All I knew was that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Something had to give. I started noticing myself paying closer attention to every little detail about the house, the finances, even Ethan's wedding plans. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a simmering need to find a way to reclaim what had been taken from me. I began spending nights hunched over spreadsheets, online property listings, and old documents I'd kept tucked away in the attic. The more I dug, the clearer it became. If I wanted justice, I couldn't rely on my parents to do the right thing. They were too comfortable in their favoritism, too blinded by the golden child bubble surrounding Ethan. One rainy evening, I stayed in the study, the faint smell of wet asphalt seeping through the cracked window, scanning through old mortgage statements. I discovered something that made my pulse quicken. My parents' mismanagement meant the house was technically at risk of being auctioned. I sat back, heart pounding, as the rain tapped steadily against the glass. A wild, audacious idea took root. What if I could buy the house myself? What if, instead of pleading or fighting for scraps, I could legally take back what was mine and finally shift the power? I caught myself smiling nervously, whispering aloud, This could work." But even as the thought excited me, it also terrified me. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about claiming the place that held all my memories, my safety, the foundation of my life. And yet, the stakes were enormous. If my parents found out, if anyone else discovered my plan, the fallout could be catastrophic. Over the next few days, I quietly researched auctions, financing options, and legal loopholes, keeping my nights sleepless and my mind racing. Meanwhile, my parents continued to gush about Ethan's dream wedding, oblivious to the storm forming quietly under the surface. Every invitation, every floral budget, every designer dress discussed was another spark lighting a fire in me. I could almost taste the possibility of finally leveling the scales, and it terrified me just as much as it exhilarated me. By the end of that week, I had made a quiet decision. I wasn't going to let them erase me anymore. I had a plan, risky and audacious, but it might be my only way to take back what was mine. And I knew one thing for certain. Once I started down this path, nothing would ever be the same. The day of the auction arrived, and I could feel my nerves tightening like a vice in my chest. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes every shadow sharper and every sound echo. I parked a few blocks away, pretending to be casual as I walked toward the courthouse, but inside, my mind was racing. This wasn't just a property purchase. It was a chance to reclaim my life, my memories, and finally assert the value I'd been denied for decades. Every step felt like walking a isugi, tightrope over a canyon I couldn't see the bottom of. Inside, the room buzzed with murmurs and the faint smell of polished wood and old paper. Potential buyers whispered and flicked through papers, while the auctioneer called out numbers in a rhythmic monotone. I clutched my folder tightly, feeling the weight of not just the bid, but of every injustice that had led me here. When the auctioneer started, my heart was hammering against my ribs. Each increment of the bid felt like a battle, every going once, going twice, reverberating through me like a drumbeat demanding courage. And then it happened. I won. The gavel slammed down, echoing in the room, and for a moment, the world froze. The house, my sanctuary, was mine again. I felt a surge of triumph, a heady mix of relief and adrenaline. Yet, beneath it all, a strange, bittersweet feeling lingered. I had won, but my parents were about to discover that everything had changed. Later that evening, I walked past the house, its familiar walls looking almost different, as if they sensed the shift in ownership. The rain had softened, leaving the air smelling of damp earth and renewal. I imagined the conversation to come, the shock, the denial, maybe even the fury. But I also felt a quiet thrill. For the first time in years, the power was in my hands. I knew the next step would be the hardest, telling my parents. But as I stood there, staring at the familiar front porch where countless memories were etched into the wood, a single thought ran through my mind. This was only the beginning, and I wasn't going to back down. I still remembered the exact moment they found out. It was mid-morning, and I had just finished organizing some paperwork in the living room when Dad's voice echoed from the hallway, sharp and incredulous. "What? What do you mean the house is sold?" His face was pale, eyes wide, like he'd just seen a ghost. Mom appeared seconds later, clutching her cardigan, a mix of confusion and outrage on her face. "Sold? To who?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly, though mostly from anger. I stayed calm, letting the tension stretch just long enough for it to sink in. "To me," I said simply, letting the words land like stones in a quiet pond. Their jaws dropped, disbelief etched in every line of their faces. Dad stumbled back a step. You can't do that. That's our home," he stammered, voice rising. "It's been in the family for decades." I swallowed, steadying myself. "It still is, but legally, it's mine now. If you want to stay, you'll need to pay rent." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Mom's lips quivered, eyes darting between me and Dad. This isn't how families behave," she said finally, voice breaking. "You can't just, this isn't fair." I wanted to say 1,000 things, but I let the words hang. For years, I had been told to be understanding and patient. Now, patience had taken a backseat to justice. Ethan wandered in, drawn by the raised voices. He froze, his confident smile faltering as he processed the scene. "Wait, you're serious?" he asked, looking from me to Mom. I nodded, and I could see the first flicker of panic cross his face. The boy who had always been celebrated as untouchable suddenly looked small, unsure. The rest of the day blurred into a mix of arguments, slammed doors, and thinly veiled threats. But beneath all of it, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of balance beginning to tilt back in my favor. Still, I knew this was only the opening move. Their shock was one thing, but how they would respond, how far they would go to try and reclaim their comfort, was the real question. and I had no intention of backing down. The next few days felt like walking through a storm that had no end. Every interaction with my parents was charged with unspoken tension, like static in the air. They tried everything they could think of: pleading, guilt-tripping, even subtle manipulation. "We just want to live here like we always have," Mom said one evening, voice trembling, though I could hear the underlying panic. "You're our child. Surely you can understand." I stared at her, feeling the bitter irony sting. The same woman who had dismissed my sacrifices for years was now appealing to sentimentality in a desperate bid for comfort. Dad tried a different tactic. We'll pay whatever you want," he muttered, shuffling papers nervously, as if throwing money at me could erase the humiliation they'd caused. "Just don't make this harder than it has to be." I held my ground, letting the silence speak louder than words. For the first time, I realized something I had never felt before: real power. The scales had shifted. I had spent my whole life being patient, responsible, and overlooked. And now the rules had changed. Ethan, of course, was caught somewhere between disbelief and anger. He stormed into the kitchen one night, slamming a hand on the counter. "This isn't fair. You can't just take our home. Mom, Dad, say something." But my parents were quiet, too stunned to intervene. I looked at him, meeting his wide-eyed stare with calm I didn't even know I possessed. "It's fair because it's legal," I said, letting the words hang in the air like a warning. "If you want to live here, you'll pay rent like anyone else." There was a subtle, almost thrilling shift in the house itself. The familiar creaks and groans no longer felt like gentle reminders of comfort. They felt like witnesses to my quiet triumph. The air smelled of fresh paint and old wood, of damp earth from a recent rainstorm outside. Every glance I caught from my parents reminded me that the balance had irrevocably changed. And yet, in the back of my mind, a small flicker of doubt remained. How far would they go to reclaim control? And what would it cost me to hold my ground? It hit me harder than I expected. How emotionally fragile this victory was. I had imagined walking into that house as the owner would feel empowering, almost intoxicating. But the reality was more complicated. Every argument with my parents, every glare from Ethan, every whispered complaint that floated through the halls chipped away at my initial triumph. I loved my family, but I couldn't ignore the sting of betrayal that lingered in every corner. Even as the rent checks began arriving on time, the house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a battlefield. One night, I found myself sitting on the back porch, rain falling in soft sheets around me, the familiar scent of wet earth filling the air. I replayed all the years of invisible work, the late nights fixing bills, the times I had smoothed over arguments or cleaned up messes that were never acknowledged. And I felt it. The rock bottom low, the sudden weight of everything I had suppressed. I was exhausted emotionally, mentally, and even though the house was technically mine, the emotional toll of standing up to my parents was heavier than I'd ever anticipated. Mom came out, hesitating in the doorway. We never thought you'd actually do it," she said quietly, her voice a mix of shock and something softer, maybe regret. I didn't answer. Words felt pointless. Her gaze dropped to the wet porch boards, avoiding mine, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability behind their anger. Dad stayed silent in the kitchen, but I could feel his presence like a shadow pressing down. Even Ethan tried one last manipulative jab. "This isn't how families are supposed to treat each other," he said, voice sharp but strained. I could feel my chest tighten as I watched him struggle with his own sense of entitlement colliding with reality. But I also realized something vital in that moment. I wasn't powerless anymore. And if I wanted to finally reclaim not just the house, but my sense of self, I had to push through this emotional low, no matter how raw it felt. The game had changed, but I knew the next move would be mine. By the next week, I knew I had to formalize things. The casual threats and hushed conversations wouldn't be enough to ensure my parents respected the boundaries I'd set. I drafted a proper rental agreement, legally binding them to pay a fair monthly amount if they wanted to remain in the house. When I handed it to Mom, she froze, her fingers trembling over the paper. You actually wrote this up?" she whispered, voice tight with disbelief. I nodded, my chest heavy, but steady. "It's official. If you want to stay, it's on these terms. No exceptions." Dad tried to protest, stumbling over his words. We can't afford this. You're being unreasonable." I held his gaze, calm but unwavering. "Then maybe it's time you consider alternatives," I said softly, letting the words land like stones. The room went quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge, and the creak of the floorboards beneath us. I felt the subtle thrill of control. The power dynamic had finally shifted, and for the first time, I wasn't just the overlooked son. I was the one setting the rules. Ethan lingered in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. "So, what now? You're just going to keep us trapped here?" he asked, voice a mixture of frustration and disbelief. I shook my head. "Not trapped, accountable, just like I've been for years." His face fell, the confident swagger he usually wore replaced by unease. It was strange to see him so small, so unsure of himself, like the roles we'd grown up with had been quietly reversed. That night, I walked through the house alone. The smell of old wood and fresh rain clung to the air, and the faint hum of the heating system felt almost like a heartbeat beneath my feet. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel pride, not just in reclaiming the house, but in reclaiming my own agency. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. My parents' resentment lingered like a shadow, and Ethan's anger simmered just below the surface. The next confrontation was inevitable, and I had to be ready. It didn't take long for word to spread through the extended family, neighbors, cousins, even some of Ethan's friends. Everyone who had ever praised him for being the perfect son now looked at him differently, and some even glanced at me with quiet admiration. I felt a strange mix of vindication and relief. For years, I had been the invisible one, the reliable son who fixed problems without recognition. Now, finally, the tables had turned. That weekend, I confronted my parents one evening while they were sipping tea in the living room. Mom's hand shook slightly as she held her cup, while Dad's eyes darted nervously around the room. "You've really done it," Mom said, almost in disbelief, her voice softening. "All these years, and now this?" I leaned back in my chair, calm and steady. "All these years, I've been doing the work that nobody acknowledged," I said, letting the words land. "And now, I'm making sure it's recognized." Ethan stood in the doorway, glaring at me, his voice tight with frustration. "You think this proves something? You're ruining everything for everyone." I shook my head, letting the tension fill the room. "No," I said, quietly but firmly. "I'm proving something for myself, something I should have realized I deserved a long time ago." As the evening went on, the arguments quieted, replaced by a heavy, almost tangible understanding. My parents couldn't manipulate or guilt me anymore. The power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. I could see their resentment simmering beneath the surface, but they were also learning, finally, what it meant to respect boundaries, what it meant to be accountable. Later, I walked through the house alone, the familiar creak of the stairs under my feet feeling like a heartbeat, steady and strong. I realized that this wasn't just about revenge or financial power. It was about reclaiming my life, my memories, and the dignity that had been overlooked for so long. And for the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of closure, even as the echoes of tension lingered around me. Something had shifted forever, and I was ready for whatever came next. Sitting alone in the living room that night, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The rain had stopped, and the faint scent of wet earth drifted through the open windows, mixing with the familiar aroma of aged wood and lingering memories. For so long, this house had been a place of comfort, but also of quiet betrayal and invisible labor. Now, it felt whole again, not because of the walls or the furniture, but because I had reclaimed my space, my voice, and my dignity. I thought about my parents, humbled and quiet, learning to navigate a life where their golden child didn't automatically get everything. I thought about Ethan, staring down the consequences of privilege he had taken for granted. And I thought about myself, standing taller than I had in years, knowing that I had done what I needed to do, not out of spite, but out of justice for myself. The power dynamics had shifted, but more importantly, I had shifted too. I no longer felt invisible, no longer felt erased. I had taken control of my life in a way that was undeniable, permanent, and empowering. As I walked through the familiar rooms, every creak of the floorboards, every faded wallpaper pattern, every corner full of memories seemed to whisper the same message. This house belonged to me, not because of inheritance, but because I had fought for it, because I had never let myself be diminished. It was proof that loyalty and patience didn't have to mean submission. They could coexist with self-respect and action. I sat on the back porch, looking at the garden where I had once played as a child. The sun was setting, casting long, warm streaks of orange across the walls of the house. I felt a rare, profound peace wash over me. For the first time, the house wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a testament to my resilience, my courage, and my ability to reclaim what was mine. Sometimes, I think back to those early conversations about Ethan's wedding and my parents' dismissive smiles. Now, I can almost laugh at the irony. The family I grew up in, the parents I loved, the brother I once envied, they all had to come to terms with reality on my terms. And in the end, I realized something vital. Sometimes the family you're born into needs to rent from the life you've built for yourself.